Let's continue our tour of approach plates with the biggest chunk on the page, the plan view. Now, the plan view gives you a bird's eye view of the area around an airport with a whole bunch of detail. Most of the symbols you see on the plan view are the same ones you're familiar with from en route charts, departure procedures, and stars. Just like a snowflake, each approach procedure is slightly different. That's because each one is custom designed to fit a specific runway and nav aid placement, as well as to protect you from terrain and obstructions. But there are many similarities in the procedures that make them easy to work with. And speaking of things that are easy to work with, let's take a look at the VOR or GPS runway 14 approach for Mansfield Lawn Municipal in Mansfield, Ohio. Now, to start off, the upper left-hand corner of the plan view is where you'll find all the frequencies you might need during this approach. The frequencies could be listed on either the top left or the top right, depending on the approach layout. What's best is that they list the frequencies in the same sequence that you'd probably use them when you're arriving at this airport. First, you'll see the ATIS frequency. Then you'll see approach, tower, ground, and Unicom. It also tells you that they have ASR, or Airport Surveillance Radar, and an ASOS on the field. Now take a closer look at the frequency list, specifically at the stars next to the approach and control tower listings. The stars tell you that those guys are not open around the clock. Hey, and did you also notice this black oval with the L inside it? It tells you that the airport has pilot-controlled lighting, and this is the frequency upon which you would control it. That would be handy to know if you needed to land after the good folks in the tower had gone home and are tucked in for the night. Another item you'll always find on the plan view is a small circle labeled MSA, which stands for Minimum Safe Altitude. On this chart, it's in the upper right corner of the plan view, but it could be at the lower right or left corners. On Jeppesen charts, you'll find the MSA circle above the plan view. Think of the MSA as your life preserver when you're flying an approach in the clouds. If you lose your navigation signals and can't talk with a radar controller, the MSA tells you how high you need to climb so you don't hit anything. If you're at or above the altitude shown within the 25 nautical mile circle, in this case 2,900 feet for most of the circle and 4,000 feet in the southeast quadrant, you're guaranteed obstacle clearance of 1,000 feet. You get that 1,000 feet of obstacle clearance as long as you're within the 25 nautical miles of the nav aid shown in the center of the circle. Unfortunately, though, the MSAs do not come with any navigation signal guarantees. The minimum safe altitude sectors are normally divided based on bearings to the nav aid used for the approach. In this case, the nav aid being used to define the MSA sectors is the Mansfield VOR, and you can tell that by the three-letter identifier MFD above the circle and the VOR symbol in the center of the circle. Now here's an MSA circle which you might guess is not a part of an approach in beautiful, but we're relatively flat here, so don't bother bringing your downhill skis, Ohio. This one is at Ontario, California, and you can tell there's some pretty high terrain in this large sector north of the Pomona Vortex with an MSA of 11,100 feet. But you would be safe at 3,500 feet southwest of the vortex and 6,800 feet southeast of it. Now, many charts have a large 10 nautical mile circle around the airport and approach track. The purpose of the circle is to tell you that the data outside it may not be drawn to scale. You may also see one or two dashed circles outside the 10 nautical mile ring to give you the perspective of feeder and or en route facilities as you see on this chart. Jeppesen charts don't use circles, but they have an inset where they show you detail when it's not to scale. Now note the letters IAF at the top of the identification box for the Mansfield Vortac. They stand for Initial Approach Fix. That's where the approach procedure itself really begins. On some approach plates, you'll only see one initial approach fix, but some approaches will have multiple IAFs. For instance, this NDB approach for Valparaiso, Indiana has 3 IAFs, and they are Gnomes up here, Knox VOR, and Sedley. In a case like this, you'd use the initial approach fix that was closest to your route of flight. As with DPs and stars, arrow styles distinguish between the approach track and other information. For instance, you can clearly see the approach track on this chart with its heavy black arrows and the inbound magnetic course, in this case 130 degrees. Now when the heavy line makes an abrupt 45-degree angle like this and ends up looking like the tip of a harpoon, it's indicating a procedure turn course reversal. You can see here that the procedure turn suggests a 265-degree course outbound and a 085-degree course inbound. We'll talk more about course reversals and techniques for flying them a little later on. Now, if you reach the missed approach point during your approach and can't see the runway, you'll have to fly the missed approach procedure. The plan view shows the initial part of the missed approach track with a closely segmented arrow like this so you can see which way to turn. It also shows the missed approach holding pattern, if there is one, like this holding pattern at Reed's intersection. Now, thinner dark arrows are used to show feeder routes. But don't start drooling over the sound of the name. Feeder routes have nothing to do with wolfing down that $100 hamburger at a nearby airport restaurant. Approach charts use feeder routes to show you the course, distance, and minimum altitude you'll use to fly from an en route nav aid or intersection to start an approach. For example, look at the NDB approach to Independence, Kansas. At the lower left, you see a feeder route from Bartlesville VOR DME to Jeffy. It tells you to fly a course of 032 degrees for 18.1 miles at a minimum altitude of 3,000 feet. And look, here's a tribute to Mikhail Gorbachev's forehead. Here's another feeder route from Lurik's intersection right over here, and another yet from Oswego Vortac. Now check out this double zigzag mark across the feeder route from Oswego. That tells you that the route is not drawn to scale. They've shortened the arrow to fit Oswego on the page. Okay, let's flip over to the VOR or GPS runway 2 approach at Neodesha, Kansas. The feeder route from Oswego on this approach is the 288-degree course, which takes you to the Field intersection, the initial approach fix. But about a third of the way up along the arrow, notice that it gets thinner and lighter in color, and you see R288 in the middle of the remaining part. Well, that svelte arrow hasn't just gone on a crash diet. When a feeder route arrow shrinks in size like this one has, it also serves as a radial that can be used to identify an intersection, in this case, Field intersection. Sometimes an arrow is used only for a radial to identify an intersection, and it's not part of a feeder route. Let's take a look at the VOR or GPS Alpha approach to Independence and look at the arrow labeled R244 that comes in from the right from the Oswego Vortac behind me. Because this arrow only has radial information labeled with an R, it can only be used to identify an intersection, in this case, Madge. It is not a flyable route for starting the approach. Remember, flyable feeder routes will always have a course with the degrees, a distance, and a minimum altitude to fly. Let's take a step back and get an overall look at the plan view for our old friend Mansfield Lahm Muni. Notice all these little symbols with dots and numbers next to them. Yes, those are obstructions, and the highest one in the plan view is shown in bold, in this case 1,852 feet. Now Jeppesen indicates the highest obstacle with an arrow. As you're scanning all the detail on the plan view, you'll want to look for notes with special instructions. This particular note tells you that when the Mansfield Tower is closed, you should use the Cleveland-Hopkins altimeter setting. As you've probably noticed, you don't get much topographical information on NOS charts. The exception to that is for bodies of water or rivers, which are relatively easy to see and may help you with your orientation. The Salton Sea, southeast of Thermal, California, is a good example. Jeppesen charts show not only bodies of water, but they also show generalized terrain contour lines. For instance, when the plan view has areas where the terrain is more than 4,000 feet above the airport elevation or more than 2,000 feet above the airport elevation within 6 nautical miles of the airport, Jeppesen will show the contour lines. Most pilots like the contour lines on JEP charts because the lines give them a good awareness of higher terrain around the airport. Oh, and one last note. You'll find a miniature airport symbol on the plan view so that you can see the orientation of the approach with the respective runways. But you'll want to look at the airport sketch section for further details. Well, as you can see, the plan view gives you an overall picture of how the approach looks from overhead. With one quick glance, the plan view graphically depicts the entire approach, and if you read the chart and execute the approach properly, you can't help but make a successful landing.